The neighbors laughed when the woman suggested insulating the house with marsh mud. Her husband didn't believe it, and everyone thought it was crazy. But when the coldest winter arrived, the laughter disappeared. Their house stayed warm while others began to freeze. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Winter on the frontier was not a season that arrived gently. It did not announce itself with color or ceremony, nor did it ease people into its grip. It came like a verdict, final and unquestionable, settling over the land with a weight that bent roofs, stiffened fingers, and silenced roads. By the time the first deep snows fell, everyone already knew what they were facing. They had lived through it before. They always did. Winter was not feared in the way storms were feared. It was accepted, the way one accepted hunger, exhaustion, and loss. It was part of the land, as unavoidable as the soil beneath the fields. The settlement lay far from any city, a loose scattering of houses pressed into a wide, open stretch of northern frontier. Each home stood apart from the others, separated by frozen fields, wind-carved drifts, and long distances that felt even longer when the cold took hold. Roads were little more than intentions scratched into the earth, visible in summer, erased in winter. When snow fell heavily, families vanished from one another's sight for weeks at a time, each household becoming its own island of smoke and endurance. The houses were simple, built with the same logic that governed everything else here. Timber walls, rough-hewn beams, roofs weighted down with sod or thatch to keep the wind from lifting them away. Every house had a hearth, and every hearth was the center of life. It was where meals were cooked, where hands were warmed, where children slept closest when the nights turned especially cruel. The hearth was not merely a feature of the home, it was the home. Without it, the structure was nothing more than a wooden shell waiting to be claimed by frost. In this place, there was one rule everyone understood, though few ever spoke it aloud. Wood meant life. Firewood was more valuable than money, more reliable than promises, more important than pride. A man could lose crops, lose livestock, even lose land, and still survive if he had enough wood stacked high against his house. Without it, winter took its payment quickly. The family lived as most did. The man had been born on the frontier and had never known another kind of life. He had learned early what worked and what did not, and he trusted those lessons with a stubborn loyalty that bordered on faith. Wood burned. Wood produced flame, heat you could see, feel, and measure, by the way ice retreated from the walls and breath no longer fogged the air indoors. Wood could be split, stacked, counted. It made sense. Anything else was guesswork, and guesswork had no place where mistakes could kill. His wife was different, though not in ways that drew attention at first glance. She was not outspoken, not defiant, not the sort of woman people pointed to as unusual. She worked as hard as anyone, kept the household running, raised the children with a steady patience that seemed endless. Yet she carried something the others did not, a quiet accumulation of memory passed down through women who had crossed oceans and borders long before this land had a name. She remembered stories told, not as lessons, but as facts, spoken while hands were busy and eyes focused on work. Stories about winters harsher than these, about places where trees were scarce and firewood could not be taken for granted. Their home reflected the balance between them. It was orderly but worn, functional rather than comfortable. The hearth dominated the main room, blackened stones bearing the marks of years of use. Around it, everything else arranged itself naturally. The table, the benches, the narrow sleeping spaces along the walls. When the fire burned well, the room felt almost kind. When it did not, cold crept inward from every surface, settling into bones and refusing to leave. The children had grown used to it. They dressed in layers even indoors, slept wrapped together for warmth, learned early not to complain. Cold was not a hardship to them. It was simply the way things were. That year, winter showed its intentions early. Autumn had been short and damp, the kind that rotted leaves before they fell and turned soil into mud. The days suitable for cutting and hauling wood had been fewer than usual, and every delay carried a cost. The man noticed it as he always did, not with panic, but with calculation. He stacked the last of the wood against the side of the house and counted the cords twice, then once more for good measure. The numbers were not disastrous, but they were tight, tighter than he liked. He said nothing. Speaking worries aloud did not make them smaller. He told himself the winter might be mild, that careful burning would stretch what they had. He had done it before. Everyone had. The first real frost came early, sealing the ground hard enough to make walking dangerous. Then snow followed, heavy and persistent, driven sideways by wind that found every gap in the walls. Nights grew longer, the fire burned more often, and the woodpile shrank at a pace that was difficult to ignore. It was during one of those evenings, when the fire had burned low and the room sat in that uneasy space between warmth and cold, that his wife spoke. She did not argue. She did not accuse him of miscalculation or press him with urgency. She spoke as if mentioning something already known, something that had merely been overlooked. She spoke about the bogland not far from their property, about the dark earth beneath the surface, dense and heavy, the kind that could burn if treated correctly. She spoke the word quietly, as if it were not meant to draw attention. Peat. The man reacted immediately, the way he always did when something challenged what he trusted. He dismissed it without cruelty, but without curiosity either. Peat was mud. Peat was wet, useless, fit only for swallowing boots and making work harder than it needed to be. People burned wood here. They always had. Suggesting otherwise sounded like desperation, and desperation made people foolish. She did not push. She did not raise her voice or insist on being heard. She simply let the idea exist between them, as solid and unyielding as the frost outside. It did not remain private for long. In small settlements, nothing did. Words traveled with ease, carried from house to house on the same paths people used to borrow tools or check on one another. By the time the week had ended, neighbors were smiling when they passed, some with amusement, others with open disbelief. There were jokes made by men who had no reason to think winter would treat them differently than it always had. There were comments about mud fires and foreign nonsense, about ideas better left behind in places where people did not know the value of a good axe. The man heard it all, and each remark tightened something inside him. He did not like being laughed at, but more than that, he did not like the thought that his household might appear weak, unprepared. On the frontier, reputation mattered almost as much as supplies. To be seen as careless was to invite isolation when it was least survivable. Still, the woodpile continued to shrink, and the cold did not ease. When he finally agreed to try, it was not with conviction. It was with resignation. He told himself that even if it failed, at least they would know. At least no one could say he had refused to act. They went to the bog on a gray morning when the air smelled of ice and water. The ground was treacherous, sucking at boots, clinging stubbornly to every step. The earth there was dark and heavy, layered in a way that did not resemble soil from the fields. His wife moved with certainty, choosing where to cut, showing him how to shape the blocks, how to lift them without tearing them apart. The work was slow and exhausting. Each piece was saturated, cold to the touch, and far heavier than any log he had ever carried. As they worked, his doubt grew. This was not the clean labor of splitting wood, where effort was rewarded with sharp cracks and clear results. This was messy, uncertain, and humiliating. passing neighbors did not bother to hide their laughter. Yet they continued. They cut, hauled, and laid the blocks out to dry, arranging them carefully, turning them as she instructed. Days passed, then weeks. The peat changed. It lightened. It hardened. It became something else. He noticed these changes reluctantly at first, then with growing attention. He said nothing, but the certainty he had relied on for years began to thin. By the time the first true blizzard sealed the settlement away from the world, the peat lay stacked near the house, dark and waiting. The woodpile was smaller now, its limits impossible to ignore. Winter had arrived fully, and with it, the moment when belief would be tested not by words, but by fire. The decision, once made, did not bring relief. It brought weight, the kind that settled in the chest and stayed there, pressing down with every breath. The man did not suddenly believe in what they were doing. Belief did not come so easily to him. What came instead was the understanding that there was no other path left that did not end in the same cold silence he had seen claim other families in harder years. Wood could fail. That truth, once unthinkable, now stood plainly before him, carved into the shrinking stack beside the house. The bog did not welcome them. Even before they reached it, the air changed, growing heavier, damp with the smell of stagnant water and decaying plants. The ground underfoot softened, each step sinking just enough to make balance uncertain. This was not land that wanted to be worked. It resisted, clung, pulled back as if offended by intrusion. The man felt the familiar irritation rise in him. Woodlands offered resistance too, but it was honest resistance. A tree stood. You cut it. It fell. The bog was different. It yielded slowly, reluctantly, without ever feeling conquered. His wife moved ahead of him, her steps careful but assured. She did not hurry. She did not second-guess her footing. She chose a place where the surface looked no different from any other, then began cutting with a steady rhythm. The blade sank into the earth with a dull sound, nothing like the sharp report of steel against wood. What emerged was dark, almost black, heavy with water and age. She lifted it with practiced care, setting it aside in a way that preserved its shape. He watched, skeptical, his arms already aching from the effort of hauling the first blocks. The peat was cold, its dampness seeping through gloves, numbing fingers within minutes. Every instinct told him this was foolish. No fire worthy of the name could come from something so sodden, so lifeless in appearance. Yet she continued without comment, and something in her quiet persistence unsettled him more than the laughter of neighbors ever had. They worked for hours, stopping only when exhaustion demanded it. By the time they returned home, both were soaked, smeared with dark earth, muscles trembling from unfamiliar strain. The neighbors noticed, of course. They always did. Words were exchanged in passing, some openly mocking, others cloaked in feigned concern. The man said nothing. There was no defense that would not sound like pleading. The days that followed were consumed by the same labor. Cutting, hauling, laying the blocks out to dry in careful arrangements that allowed air to pass around them. His wife watched the sky constantly, adjusting the stacks when rain threatened. Turning each block at intervals, she seemed to measure instinctively. The process felt endless. Each morning brought the same routine, the same mud, the same doubt. Yet time worked changes he could not deny. The peat lightened, the surface hardened, the blocks lost their slick, waterlogged sheen, and took on a texture closer to compressed earth. He lifted one after a week and felt the difference immediately. It was still heavy, but no longer dead weight. It had substance now, a kind of potential he could feel even if he did not yet trust it. The neighbors did not stop watching. Some grew bored and moved on to other concerns. Others lingered, waiting for proof of failure. The man felt their eyes even when he did not see them. He felt it most keenly at night, when he lay awake listening to the wind rake the walls, counting hours until morning, calculating how many days of heat remained if nothing else worked. It was during one of these nights that his resentment shifted. He realized that his anger was no longer directed outward, toward the bog or the neighbors, or even his wife's suggestion. It turned inward, sharp and uncomfortable. He had trusted routine more than preparation. He had assumed that what had always worked would continue to do so, and now he was paying for that assumption with fear. His wife did not speak of this change, but she noticed it. She saw the way he handled the peat with more care, the way he began turning the blocks without being asked, adjusting the stacks when the wind shifted. He still did not say he believed, but belief was no longer required for him to act with intention. As autumn slipped fully into winter, the bog froze solid enough to make further cutting impossible. What they had gathered would have to suffice. The peat stacks stood near the house now, sheltered, but exposed enough to continue drying. They looked strange beside the familiar woodpile, darker, less orderly, a reminder of how far they had stepped outside accepted practice. The first snow fell thick and fast, erasing paths, muffling sound, closing the settlement in on itself. With it came the realization that there would be no more chances to correct mistakes. Whatever they had prepared was all they would have. The man stood by the hearth one evening, staring at the fire as it consumed another log. The flames were bright, comforting, familiar. They leapt and danced, throwing shadows against the walls, promising warmth for a few hours before collapsing into ash. He knew this fire. He understood it. He also knew how quickly it could betray them if the supply ran out. Behind him, stacked and waiting, lay the peat. Silent, unassuming, unproven. He felt the weight of choice settle fully then, not as a dramatic moment, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the old certainty had already failed him. What remained was work, patience, and the willingness to endure being wrong long enough to find out whether something else could be right. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the promise of nights colder than any they had yet faced. Inside, the hearth crackled on, unaware that its role was about to change, that soon the fire it held would burn, not with flame, but with something slower, darker, and far more stubborn. The true winter did not arrive all at once. It pressed inward gradually, tightening its grip day by day, until the cold was no longer something that came and went, but something that remained, unmoving, like a living presence. The air sharpened until each breath burned. Snow piled higher with every passing storm, reshaped endlessly by the wind, into ridges and walls that made the land look unfamiliar, almost hostile. Paths vanished. Landmarks disappeared. The settlement turned inward, each household sealed off with its own worries, its own calculations, its own fear of misjudgment. The man felt the change first in the silence. Sound carried differently now. The world seemed muted, as if wrapped in thick cloth. Even the crack of splitting wood lost its sharpness, absorbed by the frozen air. He worked more slowly, conserving strength, aware that every log burned was a decision that could not be undone. The woodpile had reached the point he had been avoiding acknowledging. It was no longer a reserve. It was a countdown. The peat stood stacked nearby, dark against the snow, no longer damp to the touch. He lifted one block and weighed it in his hands. It was firm, dense, heavier than it looked, but no longer cold and wet in a way that repelled flame. Still, doubt clung to him. This was not fuel as he understood fuel. There was no grain, no scent of resin, no promise of flame hidden in its surface. It looked like earth, and earth was not meant to burn. The night they decided to try it was not chosen for drama. It was chosen because necessity no longer allowed delay. The temperature had dropped sharply that afternoon, the kind of sudden plunge that made skin sting even indoors if the fire weakened. The children sat closer to the hearth than usual, their movements slower, quieter, as if they sensed that something fragile was being tested. The man prepared the hearth with the care he would have given to any important task. He cleaned out the ash, arranged the remaining coals, then hesitated before adding the first piece of peat. His wife stood nearby, not instructing, not urging, simply present. He placed the block among the coals and waited. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no flare, no sudden surge of light. Instead, a faint glow spread slowly through the block, as if something inside it had awakened reluctantly. A thin thread of smoke curled upward, carrying a smell unlike wood, heavier, deeper, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. He leaned closer, watching for signs of failure, for the moment when it would sputter and die. It did not. The glow deepened, steadied, settled into itself. Heat radiated outward, not in waves, but in a constant presence that grew noticeable only after time had passed. The room did not warm quickly. It warmed reliably. Hours later, when he would normally have added more wood, the peat continued to smolder, unchanged. The hearth did not demand attention. It did not consume itself eagerly. It simply persisted. The man slept poorly that night, waking often to check the fire, expecting at any moment to find it gone. Each time he found the same thing, a steady, subdued glow beneath a layer of ash, alive and waiting. By morning, when he stirred the surface gently, the heat rose again, as if it had never been interrupted. Outside, the cold had tightened further. The wind scoured the snow into hard, sharp forms that rattled against the house. From the distance came sounds he had learned to recognize over years on the frontier. The faint crack of a tree splitting under its own frozen weight. The muffled thud of something collapsing far away, unseen. Signs that the land itself was under strain. News traveled slowly in winter, but it traveled. By the second week of unbroken cold, it was clear that not everyone was faring well. Some houses no longer showed smoke during the long night hours. Others burned at odd times, as families rationed what little wood they had left. People began appearing at one another's doors more often, not always with a clear purpose, sometimes simply to stand near another human presence and share a few words that distracted from the cold. The man noticed the looks directed toward his house, not laughter now, something closer to confusion, then suspicion. His chimney smoked steadily, not brightly, but without interruption. The fire inside did not flare or die. It simply endured. The coldest night of the season arrived without warning. The temperature fell so quickly that even experienced men misjudged it. By evening, the wind had risen into a constant howl that pressed against the walls, seeking entry through every weakness. Inside neighboring houses, fires burned too hot, consuming precious wood in a desperate attempt to push back the cold. Others went out entirely, leaving families to huddle under blankets, waiting for morning that offered no relief. In his house, the man banked the peat fire as his wife had shown him, covering the glowing surface with ash, sealing in the heat. The act felt wrong to him still, a deliberate suffocation of something meant to burn. Yet when he checked it hours later, he found the same quiet glow waiting beneath the surface, unchanged by the passing of time. The children slept through the night, not comfortably, but safely. Their breath did not frost the air above them. Their hands were cold, but not numb. In the morning, the man realized he had slept more deeply than he had in weeks. By midday, the first knock came. A neighbor stood at the door, face drawn, voice careful, asking questions that avoided admitting need. The man answered plainly, without triumph or apology. He did not explain everything. He did not have to. The evidence sat burning quietly behind him. More knocks followed in the days after. Some came openly, others reluctantly. A few still clung to pride, pretending curiosity where concern lay bare. The man felt something shift inside him with each visit. The shame he had carried earlier began to loosen its hold. He saw now that stubbornness was not strength, and that survival rarely looked the way people expected it to. He watched his wife as she spoke to them, showing with gestures rather than words, explaining what mattered and what did not. She did not claim credit. She did not remind anyone of their laughter. She treated the knowledge as something practical, not personal. One evening, as another storm gathered beyond the walls, the man stood alone by the hearth and considered what had changed. The fire before him did not impress. It did not command attention or admiration. It did not dance. It did not roar. It did something far more important. It stayed. For the first time, he allowed himself to think not in days, but in weeks, not in how long the woodpile would last, but in how long the winter itself might be endured. The difference was subtle, but profound. Fear retreated, not entirely, but enough to allow thought to take its place. Outside, the cold remained merciless. Inside, the peat glowed steadily, indifferent to ridicule, unmoved by doubt. The settlement had not yet realized it, but something fundamental had shifted. The winter was no longer deciding who would survive. Knowledge was. By the time the settlement understood that winter would not loosen its grip, it was already too late for many to change their fate. The cold had settled into a pattern, unbroken and indifferent, a vast stillness that pressed down on every roof and every breath. Days passed without variation. Snow no longer felt new or dramatic. It simply existed, a constant presence shaping movement, thought, and time itself. People stopped speaking of when winter might end. They spoke instead of how long it could still be endured. The man noticed the change in the way people walked. Earlier in the season, there had been tension in their steps, urgency. The restless energy of those still believing effort alone could outpace the cold. Now movements were slower, more deliberate. Each task was weighed against the energy it would cost. Each visit outside carried risk. The settlement had entered the phase of winter where survival was no longer about preparation, but about management of what remained. Loss came quietly. A cow found frozen where it had collapsed. A neighbor who did not answer his door for 2 days discovered alive but weakened. Fire long extinguished. Wood gone. Another family abandoned their home altogether, moving in with relatives before pride could turn fatal. No one spoke loudly about these things. There was no need. Everyone understood. In the man's house, the peat fire continued its steady work. It did not make the space warm in any generous sense. The walls remained cold to the touch. Frost still crept along the edges of windows, but the air no longer carried the sharp edge that cut into lungs. The hearth breathed quietly, alive at all hours, its presence as constant as the cold outside. The children grew used to the rhythm of it, to the way morning always began with the same subdued glow waiting beneath ash, patient and unchanged. With survival came responsibility. The man had known this would happen the moment the first neighbor knocked on his door, eyes lowered, questions carefully chosen. Knowledge, once proven, did not remain private for long. Neither did need. At first, requests were indirect. People asked how the fire behaved, how often it needed tending, whether it truly lasted through the night. The man answered simply, truthfully, without embellishment. He did not exaggerate its power. He did not claim it could replace everything. He spoke of what it could do and what it could not. Some listened closely. Others nodded politely and left unchanged. Then the questions grew more direct. Could he spare a block? Could he show them how to prepare it? Could his wife explain the process again, more slowly? Each request carried with it a calculation, one he could not ignore. The peat stacked beside his house was not endless. It represented months of labor, of risk taken when others had laughed. To give too much would mean returning his own family to uncertainty. These were decisions no one on the frontier prepared you for. There were no rules, no shared agreements about how to distribute survival itself. Charity could save lives, but it could also endanger those who gave too freely. The man felt the weight of this every time someone stood in his doorway, the cold biting at their heels. His wife approached the matter differently. She did not measure worth by friendship or reputation. She measured by effort. Those who asked and were willing to learn, willing to work even in the cold, she helped. She showed them how to cut peat when the bog allowed it, how to dry what little they could salvage from unfrozen edges, how to bank a fire so it did not die overnight. She gave knowledge first, fuel second. Some accepted both. Others wanted only the result, not the work. To them, she offered little. The man watched her navigate these choices with a calm that surprised him. She did not argue. She did not justify herself. She understood something he was only beginning to grasp. Survival shared without understanding only delayed failure. Survival shared with knowledge could multiply. Gradually, a small shift took place within the settlement. Smoke began appearing again from chimneys that had gone dark. Not bright, eager smoke, but thin, steady streams that resembled his own. Fires burned lower. Nights grew less frantic. The cold did not lessen, but panic did. The neighbors no longer laughed when they passed his house. They no longer avoided his eyes either. Conversations changed tone. People asked for advice without mockery, listened without interruption. The man felt his posture change in response, straightening not with pride, but with something steadier. Respect on the frontier was not granted by words. It was earned by endurance. He also noticed the way his relationship with his wife had shifted. Where once he had felt challenged by her suggestion, he now felt anchored by her presence. She had not proven herself through argument or defiance. She had done it through patience and preparation, through trusting knowledge that did not need validation until it was tested. He understood now that strength did not always announce itself. Sometimes it waited quietly for conditions to reveal it. Winter dragged on. Weeks blurred together, marked only by storms and brief, clear days that revealed a sky so sharp and pale it hurt to look at. The peat stack shrank, but predictably, evenly. There were no sudden shortages, no desperate recalculations. Each day followed the last, with a reliability that felt almost luxurious under the circumstances. In the coldest stretch, when the wind howled without pause for 3 days and nights, the man experienced something he had not expected. He stopped counting, not because he had stopped caring, but because the fear that had driven the counting no longer controlled him. The system held. The fire endured. That was enough. When spring finally approached, it did so reluctantly. The snow did not vanish in dramatic collapse. It softened, darkened, receded inch by inch. Water appeared where none had been for months. The land exhaled slowly, as if unsure whether it was safe to release winter's grip entirely. On the first day the peat fire was allowed to go out, the man felt a strange hesitation. He watched the last glow fade, not with relief, but with respect. That fire had carried them through something that would once have broken him. It had done so without spectacle, without noise, without demanding belief in advance. Outside, the bog lay waiting, unchanged, indifferent to the winter it had helped them survive. He knew now that the knowledge his wife carried was not a relic of another place or time. It was a way of thinking, one that valued resilience over display, reliability over habit. The settlement emerged from winter altered. Some lessons would be forgotten as comfort returned. Others would linger, passed quietly from one household to another, remembered the next time preparation seemed unnecessary. The man understood that they would never speak of that winter as a victory. There were no celebrations for simply remaining alive, but in the quiet of the thawing days, as the land began its slow recovery, he felt something close to certainty. Not the brittle certainty he had once relied on, but one built on experience. They had survived, not because they burned brighter than the cold, but because they burned longer. And that, he knew now, made all the difference. If this story made you see survival and resilience in a new way, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More stories like this are coming, exploring forgotten knowledge, hard choices, and the quiet strength that keeps people alive when everything else fails. Watch the next video to continue the journey and share this story with someone who would appreciate it.